Well, it's Tuesday morning, and we're back at it with the Rhine Report. And today's news is absolutely crushing for democracy in America, as we have had now, in the last several hours, 3 separate declarations from the United States government in answer to Judge Sinnis's demands for explication, complete rebuff to the judge, complete disrespect to her, to the federal district court, and to the Supreme Court of the United States. And just as I predicted in 2 or 3 previous podcasts, John Roberts snuck in that loophole of the terminology he used in the per curiam order, trying to excuse the United States government's interference with the constitutional rights of an innocent man, using terminology like facilitate rather than effectuate. I warned about this. I've warned about this in previous videos. And this morning I had a look at Michael Popak again on Legal AF, because he has access to the 2 or 3, I think it's 3 declarations, all completely rebuffing the judge's order on facilitation. So, what's going to happen next? We've seen the White House presser.
A lot of legalese in all of this, so luckily we have a legal expert, Deanna Paul here, trial attorney, former assistant New York City District Attorney. Welcome. So we've had a lot of, I'm going to play a clip from Stephen Miller at the White House in a minute, but just taking up what you just heard from the president of El Salvador, the Supreme Court said to them, you should try to facilitate the return. And everyone in that Oval Office meeting, and the people who would be under the jurisdiction, including the president, the attorney general, they showed no interest in that. And obviously, either did the president of El Salvador. How do you see this?
It seems like they're parsing words in a somewhat juvenile way. When a court says facilitate this, I mean, it's common parlance. We know what that means.
What does it mean?
It means help us get him back.
Right.
Which Buceke, this monster from El Salvador, who has obviously bargained and contracted to house ICE removed prisoners, men and probably even women, we don't know. We don't know all the particulars. We don't know how many, from the United States without a hint of due process. Now, what is the Supreme Court going to do about this? Judge Zinnis, yes, she can file, contempt citations, but that doesn't bring anyone back home from this hellhole in El Salvador, SACOT. That is simply not an answer. I believe the lawyers for the removed and imprisoned asked for an emergency hearing in front of the Supreme Court. And when push comes to shove here, either the Supreme Court will act and do the right thing without hesitation, without doubt, without vacillation, then we are in deep shit. Because they are the last vestige of what might be called a constitutional republic. But if they indulge this president, who is an absolute monster and a dictator, if they allow him to get away with loosely described terms like foreign policy and executive sovereignty, and all these kind of, conflated ideas of presidential power to obliterate the rights of human beings under a constitution that was written 240 years ago, then this is the end for America. It's over. Unless there's a revolution in the streets, unless there's a military intervention, this is over.
Do you plan to ask
Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CB.
Thank you, President. Do you plan to ask President Bukele to help return the man who your administration says was mistakenly deported? The man who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure, President. First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, two courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So will you return him?
And you are doing a great job.
Thank you.
Stephen Miller, wait a minute. Can you just also respond to that question? Because, it's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant. Because they're totally slanted because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But would you answer that question also, please?
Yes, gladly. So, as Pam mentioned, there's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So, it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As two immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any form of immigration relief in the United States. So he had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful, and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
So you don't plan to
But
ask
the
for
Supreme
anything
Court's
to get him
asking
back?
to.
And
that
what was the ruling
facilitate-
in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
In our favor.
in our favor against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual, at El Salvador's sole discretion, was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time.
Well,
No version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador. Your questions about it, per the court, can only be directed to him.
I asked
¿Usted lo
President
liberaría,
Bukele, what is
Presidente
your, can President Bukele weigh in on this? Do you plan to return him?
Well, I'm suppose you're not suggesting that I smuggle terrorists into the United States, right?
It's
I mean,
always
how can I smuggle? How can I return him to the United States? Like, I smuggle him into the United States, or what do I do? Of course, I'm not going to do it. It's like, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States. I don't have the power to return him to the United States.
But you can release him inside El Salvador.
Yeah, but I'm not releasing, I mean, we're not very fond of releasing terrorists into our country. I mean, we just turned the murder capital of the world into the safest country of the Western Hemisphere, and you want us to go back into the releasing criminals so we can go back to being the murder capital of the world? No, that's not going to happen.
Well, they'd love to have a criminal, released into
I mean, there's a fascination.
They would love it.
Yeah.
They're sick. These are sick people. Marco, do you have something to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Eitland, I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin, except for Venezuela that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President, no, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
And that's what the Supreme Court held, by the way, to Marco's point. The Supreme Court said exactly what Marco said, that no court has the authority to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. We won a case 9-0, and people like CNN are portraying it as a loss, as usual, because they want foreign terrorists in the country who kidnap women and children. But President Trump, his policy is foreign terrorists that are here illegally get expelled from the country, which, by the way, is a 90-10 issue.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on Air Force One just a few days ago, and they said that it must be facilitated.
Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over, and that's why nobody watches you anymore. You have no credibility. Please, go ahead.
President Trump, thank you very much. How many illegal criminals are you planning on exporting to El Salvador? And President Buceke, how many are you willing to take from the U.S.?
As many as possible. And I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please? As many as we can get out of our country that were allowed in here by incompetent Joe Biden through open borders. Open borders. You probably hear open borders and you can't even understand it because nobody can understand. Nobody smart or with common sense can understand it. So we have millions of people that should not be in this country.
This is it for the Supreme Court, because we have crossed the Rubicon. Either we have a legal system, either we have justice, either we have due process, either we have a constitution or not, is now at stake. The Supreme Court, if it fails to act and do the right thing now, will be the undoing, the final death knell to American democracy. And make no mistake about it, the U.S. government and this fascist regime in charge of it cannot possibly argue that this is all okay under the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. That is something of a sick joke, because the statute is so clear that it's just a ridiculous assertion. Equally, I tried to explore 1226, 1226A, 1227, 27A, 237, 212, all of the immigration and naturalization laws possible to look at. And all I see are these conclusory allegations through the letters from Homeland Security and others, referring to the fact that this is foreign policy, this is about terrorism. There's no terrorism involved here by definition. A gang is a gang, even if you were to use that pretext. It's got nothing to do with terrorism. McVeigh in Oklahoma was terrorism. So this is a complete and utter nonsense. But it's going to come down to 6 fascist judges drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough is enough.